Dufu, Elegies on Ancient Sites number 3, the birthplace of Wang Zhaojung. Through flocks of mountains, myriad valleys, I arrive in Jingmen, where radiant lady was born and bred. The village is still there. Once she left the red palace walls, there was nothing but endless desert. Only her evergreen grave is left to face the twilight. A portrait once recorded her spring fresh face. The tinkle of girdle pendants heralds her soul's vain return by moonlight. For 1,000 years the pipa has wailed in its alien tongue, as if its strings bemoan in song her tragic tale of grief. So we continue with the third of Du Fu's elegies on ancient sites. The first two ones that we read in the previous days basically evoked poets who were from the south and who had lived in the south. But now Du Fu is probably continuing his sightseeing while he's living in this Yangtze River Valley area. And he probably passed through the birthplace of a famous ancient beauty, Wang Zhaojung, the radiant lady that is referenced in the poem. So just like the previous poems, there is an element of sightseeing, like the poet is passing through an area connected to a figure of the past and composes a poem on the topic. More than the other poems, I don't see the connection between the figure being referenced in Du Fu here, because the figure being referenced here is a woman who lived among the barbarians, so not a poet, not a figure with whom Du Fu could immediately identify. But well, it's an important figure and a good symbol of a woman suffering under barbarians, which matches the plight of the empire, you could say, in the time of Du Fu. So first of all, the story of Wang Zhaojung. So Wang Zhaojung lived in the time of the Western Han Dynasty. She was a beautiful woman from the south, and she was one of the many women that were sent to the palace to become secondary consorts or concubines of the emperor. At that time, it was Han Juandi. Now, the histories tell us that in the year 33, when a leader of the barbarians, of the northern barbarians, the Xiongnu, who were the greatest scourge of the Chinese, when that leader, Hu Hanye, came to pay tribute at the Chinese court, by that time, after the wars of Emperor Han Wudi, the barbarians of the north had more or less accepted a subordinate and tributary position with respect to China. So the emperor decided to give him a bride. This was a custom that had started in the beginning of the Western Han Dynasty, called the Heqin policy, when the barbarians were much stronger, and to appease them, the Chinese emperor sent a princess as a wife to the Shanyu chief, to the Shanyu, who was the chief dame of the Xiongnu, along with tribute, along with silk and cereals and other luxury items. This woman was never really a princess, a daughter of a reigning emperor, but she was named a princess and sent on her way. So this Wang Zhaochun was sent as the bride of Huhanye Chanyu, and she married him, and she had children by him. She lived in barbarian lands. After her husband died, she was forced to marry one of his brothers, because this was the Xiongnu law. The successor of a ruler was generally one of his brothers, and the previous ruler's wives had to marry the new ruler. Now, this is what can be extracted from the historical chronicles of the Eastern Han Dynasty. But the myth that arose around Wang Zhaojun made the story much more romantic and tragic and literary than what probably the real facts that are approximately what I have just summarized a minute ago. So the legend of her grew with time. She became named one of the four great beauties of ancient China, and she ended up appearing in many fictional works, including plays. And in the developed form of the legend, the story ran that she was the most beautiful woman in China, But she hadn't bribed the court painter, and because she hadn't done this, the painter had disfigured her painting. So when the emperor saw her portrait, he decided not to meet her. She became one of the lesser concubines whom he never visited. And only after giving her to Hu Hanye did the emperor see her face to face and lament, but too late, the situation that he had created. And also, according to the legends, she didn't want to go to the barbarian lands. In some of the legends, she killed herself just on reaching the frontier. And another legend, which is referenced in the poem, is that her gravesite became a mound in the middle of the steppe of that desert land of the north, and her mound was the only green place to be seen in all that arid and desertic area. So these are the legends. Wang Zhaojung becomes evidently, like other women before and after her, a symbol for Chinese society being subdued or kept in captivity by barbarians. The Chinese woman in a foreign land lamenting her fate, being cut off from civilization and family, is a tragic topic. Although I would venture to say, and this is my own personal interpretation, that I don't think these women would have been so badly treated or in so bad condition among the barbarians. So the Chinese, especially later during the song, adopted a very, misogynistic attitude towards women. There were already traits of it before. I mean, women were seen as subordinate creatures with respect to men. And in fact, afterwards, from the Song Dynasty onwards, they were even crippled by forcing them to have the lotus feet. So they were turned into permanent invalids. And during the Tang Dynasty, powerful women, the rich ones, the members that were related with the royal household, had a great deal of power and autonomy. And you can see this even in Tang art, with Tang women riding horses and so on. But still, they were second-rate citizens. And I imagine that among the barbarians, a Chinese woman of high upbringing, wife of the tribal ruler, would have been granted respect, powerful, and perhaps even affection. But anyway, I am missing my mark. So Du Fu is passing through the area, the alleged village in which Wang Zhaojun was born, and he makes a poem lamenting her sad plight, her sad fate, having to live among the barbarians, and even after death, her soul still sighing and wishing to return to her native China. So let's take a look at the poem as we usually do, couplet by couplet. First couplet. Through flocks of mountains, myriad valleys, I arrive in Jingmen, where radiant lady was born and bred. The village is still there. So as usual, the first couplet locates us, if not chronologically, at least geographically. Du Fu, as we know, in the 760s, is traveling down the Yangtze River area, living most of the time in a boat with his family. And along those detours of the river, he reaches the village that was allegedly the birthplace of this famous figure of the past and of the historical chronicles. He arrives in Jingmen. Jingmen means the gates of Jing. Jing was an ancient name for the kingdom of Chu. So we're in the heartland of the south, the area of the ancient kingdom of Chu. And this was the place where Radiant Lady was born. Radiant Lady is a nickname for Wang Zhaojung, one of the names she was given as a concubine. All the concubines and wives of an emperor had, very specific titles depending on the hierarchy. And I imagine that Radiant Lady is one of them. In this case, for a very minor imperial consort. Second couplet. Once she left the red palace walls, there was nothing but endless desert. Only her evergreen grave is left to face the twilight. So the second couplet moves us along into the legend. It's also spatial and geographical, but it describes the places through which Wang Zhaojun moves. And basically we have two, it's a parallelistic couplet, but we have two contrasted places, which are also a general contrast for China versus civilization. So the red palace walls versus the endless desert. So she was a concubine at the imperial palace, red, same word as purple, the imperial color. And she moves from the red walls to the endless desert, because the steppe in the north is not exactly a desert. There are big patches of desert in the area to the north and northwest of China, but also mainly grassland, steppe land. But an area with a pretty harsh climate, especially out of the spring season, I imagine. So there's this image, a beautiful red palace versus an endless desert. And in the second line also an evergreen grave versus, the twilight and the dry brownish steppe, or just the uniform blankness under the darkness, of emerald like green mound shining in the sapphire darkness of night and the heavens. So two images contrasting, and not only is it one Chinese and one non-Chinese, also the first couplet denotes the first line of the couplet denotes her parting, and the second line her ending, because she died among the barbarians and couldn't get back. And so that mound stands up as a metonymy, as a symbol for her and for China in exile. A portrait once recorded her spring fresh face. The tinkle of girdle pendants heralds her soul's vain return by moonlight. So just as the previous couplet took us to the middle of the story, media res, we could say, with Wang Zhaojung departing and dying in exile, and this was not so much narrated as represented through those visual images of the red palace walls, the endless desert, the evergreen grave, the twilight. Now we get some objects which are associated and again act as a metonymy, as an extension, and as a reference by extension to Wang Zhaojun herself. So what remains of this lady, we don't know, but objects are associated with her. First, a portrait that once recorded her beauty. I imagine the reference to this portrait is perhaps a reference to the legend that I've just talked to you about, the idea that she was painted by a court painter who represented her uglier than she really was. So only a portrait remains, a memento, although we might imagine that Du Fu would have seen paintings, recreations of her painted afterwards, in which this was a common topic to represent in painting. And the tinkle of girdle pendants heralds her soul's vain return by moonlight. We have a sight, the sight of an object associated with her, a portrait, and we have the sound of an object associated with her, tinkling girdle pendants. So Chinese men and women, one of the accessories that they carried were, pieces of jewelry, pendants that were hung from the waist, from the girdle. So the idea here is that the soul of Wang Zhaojun is unhappy at being, imprisoned or with her tomb in the barbarian lands, and by night or in dreams, the soul tries to return back into China. So at night it might travel, and in that travel, her soul is still carrying girdle pendants, and they make this glingling, tinkling sound as she hopes to return back. But like Sisyphus with the rock, she always, I imagine, has to return to her tomb, to her northern barbarian homeland by morning. Finally, the conclusion, last couplet. Another object evokes her, although this time it's not an object associated with her directly. It's rather an object that evokes her. And ironically, the object is a barbarian object that becomes Sinicized, whereas she is a Chinese woman that becomes barbarianized, if you will. For 1,000 years, the pipa has wailed in its alien tongue, as if its strings bemoan in song her tragic tale of grief. So now finishes the poem with an object. The pipa is a type of lute. It's very similar to the Spanish lutes of the Middle Ages, like with a very big belly. And this is a musical instrument that was not originally Chinese. The quintessential Chinese instrument is the guqin, which is a type of horizontal harp or thither that is still the instrument of choice of the scholar officials. In the Han Dynasty, one instrument, along with musical styles that came to the expanded empire of Han Wudi, was the pipa, this lute that came from Central Asia, from the area of what was then an area of what today is called Turkestan, and then historians have called Serindia, the place of Turkestan, of the Uyghurs in Central Asia, which was a crossroads of Chinese and also Indian civilization. So this instrument comes, it's a foreign instrument, but it becomes Sinicized pretty early. And we've seen it referenced, for example, in the Pipachi, the poem by what's his name, by Bai Juji about Jiang Weifei. But here, the instrument and the music it makes, the sad songs that can be plucked on its strings, are interpreted or are read as the laments 1,000 years after, in fact, a bit more than 1,000 years, after Wang Zhaojung had to go and live and die with the barbarians. This instrument that came from the barbarians still keeps crying for her and representing her laments. And as I said, interesting because of the duality. This is a barbarian instrument that becomes Sinicized, just as Wang Zhaojung is a Chinese woman that becomes, or is forced to live the barbarian life among the barbarians. So quite a nice poem, pretty conventional topic, and sad, melancholy topic, but a pretty satisfactory poem.